Good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you are in the world. We are very pleased to have you at another session of Discovery EE. My name is Natasha Daniel, and I am the communications lead at Efficiency Canada. I am joining you from Tikaronto, also known as Toronto, which is a Mohawk word, which means where there are trees in the water. I'd like to share that this is home to the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Wendat, and various Inuit, Métis, and First Nations peoples. While we're at a remote workplace, Efficiency Canada is based at Carleton University, which is located in the traditional unceded territories of the Algonquin Nation. Before we get started, this is just a reminder to everyone that our two guest speakers will present for about 20 minutes, and then we'll open the floor to questions. So please use the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen. This way other people can update what they really want to hear about, and we can vote that. So today we have with us Emma Hill, who is a principal analyst at Dunsky Climate and Energy Advisors. We also have Brendan McEwan, who's also a managing consultant at Dunsky Climate and Energy Advisors. So they'll be presenting a rationale for EV-ready requirements in non-residential buildings and detail how these could support the clean mobility transition. Take it away, guys.
Thanks, Natasha. Really appreciate you folks putting this on and having us here today. Hello, everyone. Great to have you with us here today. Me and Brendan are going to be doing a presentation on EV-ready requirements for non-residential buildings. I'm going to go through it fairly quickly because I think it's really important that we have some time for questions and discussion at the end. So if you have any questions, feel free to throw them in the chat, and we're happy to touch base on it maybe at the end of the presentation. Okay, so let's park that, developing EV-ready requirement recommendations for non-residential buildings. So a quick agenda about what we're just going to go over in the next about 15 minutes. So a quick overview about EV charging and EV-ready parking, as well as touching in on EV energy management systems and how they play an important role in this. Then we're going to get into about EV-ready requirements and why we think they're an important tool to leverage when we talk about the clean energy transition, especially in the transportation sector. And then we're going to wrap up with some best practices. So recently, we've been working with the City of Richmond on developing recommendations for non-residential EV-ready requirements. So we're going to go into our process for assessing different ways to structure those requirements. And then we're going to wrap up with some discussion and questions. Okay, EV charging. There's 3 broad levels of EV charging. We've got level 1, level 2, and DC fast charging. And the cheat sheet way of really figuring out the difference between them is that each of these classifications of charging is going to take a different amount of time to fully charge up a vehicle. So we have level 1, which is the slowest type of charging. It's a 120 volt outlet, much slower charge than the other 2. It can be sufficient for some homes, but level 2 is ultimately the main charging type that most homes will want and is also ideal for workplace charging. It provides a faster rate of charge, more commonly can provide 32 amps. And this means that it can typically provide 40 to 50 kilometers worth of charge per hour. And then on the right here, we have DC fast charging. It's the fastest type of charging. It's used for public charging and really only for public charging because the cost of providing that power at that voltage is much too high at the residential or workplace level. Okay, and now we have what we call like our charging pyramid. And the goal of this visualization is to show the breakdown of how those different charging types that just discussed on the previous slide can really help facilitate the different use cases of charging, and also highlight the utilization or the amount of charging that happens within each of these tiers of the pyramid. So about 70 to 80% of all kilowatt hours for EV charging goes to home charging. Most people want to charge at home. It's just the easiest, it's most accessible, it's in their routine of going home, parking their car, and leaving it for a longer period of time. So access to home charging is really a huge determinant of the pace of EV adoption that we're going to see over the next 10 to 15 years. So for early days, early adopters are typically those that have access to home charging, typically in single-family homes. And this is the base of our home charging. Most people want to charge at home. Then we have our multifamily home. And the reason why we have a second tier for this is that there's different barriers for people living in MURBs or multifamily or multi-unit residential buildings that make accessibility to home charging a little bit more difficult than those in a single family home. Then we also have workplace or employees at a workplace that need to charge. That type of charging is really going to help provide an option for charging for those that don't have access to home charging, or those that are commuting further distances for work and do need that little bit of top-up charge when they're doing those longer distances. Another great thing about workplace charging, though, is typically people are going to be charging during the day with it, which is really great when we're talking about peak impacts overall of EV charging, especially in the future, if we can be charging during the day at those off-peak times. So we also have fleet charging and public charging. Public charging actually have the lowest usage here in this pyramid scheme, but it's important for some opportunity charging for people to get that access to quick top-ups. But also there's kind of the chicken and egg aspect of public charging. Even though most people are going to end up charging at home if they have access to charging, especially in the early days, it's a clear signal if people can see public chargers that they feel that they have that option and feel more comfortable with adopting an electric vehicle. Okay, so getting into EV readiness and what do we need by EV ready infrastructure? Really, EV ready, it's an adjacent electrical outlet that's beside a parking space, which in the future, you can install an EV charger to. So it's just talking about this electrical outlet here in the cartoon. Can you guys see my mouse if I hover it over?
Yeah.
Perfect, great. So when we talk about an EV ready adjacent outlet, we're talking about this piece here. It's important to note that it can be the receptacle, what this cartoon is showing here, but it also can be a junction box where you can hardwire in a charger at a later date. So that's what we talk about when we mean EV ready infrastructure. But it's also important to think through the whole process of if you're going to have sufficient upstream electrical capacity once that charger is eventually installed, and that you're going to have enough capacity then for all of the different EVs to charge. So there's different parts to this process you need to think through. If you have sufficient upstream electrical capacity, so if you have the correct utility service and transformer that's going to be able to provide that capacity, go through the meter, and then if you have the right hardware, like the distribution switchgear, a panel, that all needs to be there before you can actually install that charger at a later date. And EV energy management systems are going to be critical for when we think about how we're going to future-proof all of the charging that we need to provide, both residentially and also for workplace charging and in the commercial sector. So EV energy management systems, the best way to think about them is that they are allowing charging stations to have a degree of intelligence. So that charging can happen in the most efficient way in the future and also in the most cost-effective way as we build out more and more EV-ready parking stalls. So in the figure here, we have a branch circuit that's coming off a panel, and it's connecting to 4 separate parking spaces, 4 different chargers for 4 different vehicles, all connected to one branch circuit. So you can imagine with EVSM, with load management, if you have all 4 vehicles that are plugged in and charging at the same time, or actually, let's start with the easier example. If you have one vehicle that's parked in there, just one vehicle, it can take the entire capacity of that branch circuit. It can charge up faster because it gets the full juice from the branch circuit. But if you get more vehicles that come in and park, and you actually have all 4 that are there and trying to charge up at the same time, what an energy management system can do is actually lower the amperage that's going to the vehicles so that you don't trip the breaker. And it just means that's going to result in a slower charging time for those 4 vehicles. And there's really great use cases for that. For example, we've talked about in residential buildings, so in MURBs, if you have vehicles parked overnight, it's fine if you slow down that charging rate because they're parked there for a long period of time. Another great use case is workplace charging. So there's some really key advantages to EV energy management systems. So there's the reduction in the electrical capacity and associated electrical infrastructure costs to provide EV charging, which is great. There's also managing EV loads to maximize value. So this is where you can avoid demand charges, respond to dynamic rates, respond to utility demand response events. So it can really help with EV load and also make sure that you're doing everything cost effectively. So really just the summary, I guess, is EVEMS. I always say EVEMS, but EV energy management systems are important to enabling high levels of EV charging in multifamily buildings, workplaces, and fleet depots is the other great use case. Okay, and now just a quick overview of some different electrical configurations when it comes to EV management systems. There's a variety of electrical configurations. So the one that I was just discussing at the branch circuit is in the top left. That's really talking about when you have circuit sharing, one branch circuit that can then serve multiple EV chargers, and you just need to not exceed the branch circuit capacity. There's also in the top right, we have a similar idea, but it's just happening at the panel level. So you have panel sharing, so you can overload that electrical panel. You can also combine branch level and panel sharing. In the bottom left, we have feeder sharing. This is typically found more in single family homes, but that's where you have the utility meter feeding electricity to the panel through a feeder. And the management system is monitoring the capacity of that feeder. That means if you have a bunch of things going on, you're having a party, the oven's on, actually, everything's on. At that point, then your feeder knows to lower the charging, not prioritize the EV charging. But typically, you're always going to have enough capacity at the feeder level to give you those regular levels of charge. And in the bottom, we have service monitoring. Now, this typically happens more in MURBs or larger buildings, and that's happening at the main switchboard leading into the panel. And this is really important. This is typically something that can be done to help avoid high utility costs or costly utility upgrades for a larger building. Okay, I'm going to pass it off to Brendan McEwan just to talk about designing for load sharing using energy management systems to reduce costs.
Okay, thanks, Emma. Hi, all. So just going to speak to this slide regarding the value of providing or designing for EV energy management systems in new construction. So sometimes most familiar way to provide EV charging infrastructure is where you've got just dedicated unmanaged circuits. And so that's this tallest bar here. This is for a costing study that we, with my previous employer, AS Engineering, prepared for the Clean Air Partnership in Ontario, looking at the cost to provide every parking space in a multifamily building in Toronto with an EV-ready outlet. So if you do this without any form of energy management, you're looking at a fairly substantial cost of around $5,500 per parking space. That's the tallest bar. And the reason for that is predominantly you've got to have enough panels and dedicated branch circuits to each parking space, and that winds up being a lot of copper in the building and a lot of labor to install that. But there's ways that we can provide for an excellent quality of charge for a home application or a workplace application, doing, let's say, 4 share on 40 amp branch circuits, or other types of configurations like 10 share on 80 amp branch circuits that can result in much lower costs. So the takeaway message from this slide is that designing for use of EV energy management is going to allow us in both new construction as well as retrofit applications to have substantially lower costs. In those types of circumstances, let's say home charging or workplace charging, where it's appropriate to have that level of sharing. So hopefully that's reasonably clear. I'll pass it back to Emma.
Just looking at the time, I'm going to try to really zoom through this section, and so we can get to the meat and potatoes of the best practices. The tagline here is that EVs are coming, and they're going to be coming fast, especially in BC. This is the Clean BC Roadmap to 2030 Zero Emissions Act commitment that's showing out to 2030, and then also hitting that 100% ZEV mandate by 2035. So in historic, we have that light blue curve, and in dark blue, we have our projection for percent annual EV sales. And maybe just when I talk about EVs, we're talking about BEVs, battery electric vehicles, and FEVs are plug-in hybrid electric vehicles. But really, we're going to see a lot of EVs that are coming on the road soon. Why is that important, or why are we looking to help improve charging access so that we can accelerate this EV adoption? Because there's benefits of transitioning private vehicles to EVs. So first and foremost, there's reducing our GHG emissions. That's in line with the SEEP GHG reduction targets. There's better air quality and also an economic vitality over time. As we get more and more people driving EVs, there's a lower cost of maintenance and ownership through fuel costs that is going to be helpful for folks. So improving access to charging is going to be a key lever that we need to reduce barriers to EV adoption and really get us up that S-curve of more and more people driving electric vehicles. One thing to note, though, is like while we're very focused on the electrification of personal vehicles, electrification of personal vehicles is not the only tool in the toolbox. There's many more pieces of the puzzle that need to happen if we want to achieve our transportation climate goals. That means avoiding personal vehicle use overall, shifting to sustainable modes of transport, and also improving emissions from vehicles currently on the road and in the future. Okay, So where are we at right now? So this is just a table that highlights EV-ready new construction requirements that are happening across Canada. So we have the jurisdiction on the left in this table, and then these are all of the jurisdictions that have adopted residential EV-ready new construction requirements. And that is got a lot of traction, and Brendan has been involved in developing a lot of that policy, so he'd be happy to touch on it at the end. But one thing to note is then on the right, in our last column there, we have those who have been implementing EV-ready new construction requirements for commercial or non-residential buildings, and that's still underway. It's still to be determined in a lot of jurisdictions and is really just starting to get more traction now. So when we talk about the charging ecosystem, why it's important that we do look at that commercial segment or the non-residential segment as well, is while we've spoken about this, while the vast majority of charging does happen at home, there's still a need to support that other 30% of charging that does not take place at home. And it's EV-ready non-residential parking requirements that could support both the workplace and opportunity charging, which I'm going to get into in the next slide. So if you look down at this charging ecosystem below, we've really zeroed in on how residents or people with personal vehicles are charging. There's those that have access to home charging if they live in a single family home or in a MARB, a multi-unit residential building, or those without home charging access at all, or charging orphans. And these are all the different ways that they can get access to charging, whether it's at home or if it's through public charging. And we really are going to be focusing in on this workplace charging and this private sector opportunity charging piece, because that's the type of charging that EV-ready non-residential requirements are going to help elevate. So what do we mean by workplace charging and opportunity charging? Workplace charging is, you probably have a good idea of it. It's where employees can park while they go and do their work. Typically happens from 8 a.m. to 5 p.m., but can be throughout the course of the day. What's important here is to think about dwell times or the use case of these parking stalls and how they differ between workplace and opportunity charging. So workplace charging, vehicles typically are parked for longer periods of time. And that means that they can use a slower charging rate, and they can actually really leverage significant load sharing using EV energy management systems, as we discussed before, because they're going to be parked there for a longer period of time. Now let's think about opportunity charging. Opportunity charging is more about if you're popping by and going to the store for retail, assembly parking, it's customers or visitors going. And what's important to differentiate that from workplace charging is that they typically have shorter parking times. You go to the grocery store, or if you go and need to buy a new sweater type thing, you're going to be parked there not for 8 hours likely, but maybe ranging from half an hour to 4 hours, depending on your use. What that means is you need faster charging if you want to provide the most appropriate charging for that EV user. And there you want to see more minimum dedicated 40 amp circuits so that it can provide that faster charging rate, or have access to DCFC or faster level 2 charging, which can be appropriate in some use cases. Okay, so we're going to get into our best practices then of how we can support workplace and opportunity charging through EV-ready requirements for non-residential buildings. So these are the 3 options that me and Brendan dived into, we assessed for structuring non-residential EV-ready requirements. So the first is what we're going to call a flat rate, or a consistent requirement. And that means that requirement is the same for all different land uses or building occupancy sites when it comes to zoning bylaws. So there is a consistent percentage of parking spaces that must be EV ready. So for example, the City of Vancouver and the City of North Van have this requirement, and they require 45% of all non-residential parking be EV ready. The City of North Van breaks that down even further. So the way that they actually subsegment that, because we talked about workplace and opportunity charging of how they're different, is that they require 35% of parking stalls to have significant load sharing allowed so that they can support that workplace charging. If there's load sharing, then it's potential for having a slower charge. So it's for people that are parked there longer. Then there also needs to be 10% with higher power for opportunity charging. So that's the flat rate. There's pros and cons to it for sure. One of the pros, simplest to implement, what's a flat rate across all of the different land uses. Easy to disseminate that information, easy to administer, etc. A challenge though for it is that there can be different use cases for different types of commercial businesses. For example, you're going to get a different ratio of who needs workplace charging versus who needs opportunity charging. A storefront is maybe going to need a different split of that type of charging than, say, an office space. So that's one of the challenges or cons with it. Okay, then we have our second structure option, and that's the variable requirement by land use. And that's where you still have a percent of stalls that are required to be EV ready, but now it varies by land use. So that means that office building is going to have a different proportion of workplace and opportunity charging than that retail storefront. Examples of where this is happening is the District of Saanich, and it's also been proposed by the International Energy Conservation Code, where it includes different percentage requirements for different building occupancies. Again, pros and cons. The pro is that it's actually fixing that last con that we talked about. Now you can really make sure that you're getting the right type of charging available for the different EV users based on what type of establishment or commercial establishment that they're visiting. One of the cons, though, a lot trickier to administer. That's a lot more to set up, a lot less direct. A lot of people don't understand zoning bylaws and things like that. And all the players need to be on the same page when really getting this going. Okay, and then the third option assessed is charging capacity per parking space requirement. So what this means is that it would require a minimal aggregate amount of charging capacity per new parking space. And then there's flexibility within that to determine the number of chargers and level of EV charger deployed. The best example of this is, let's say there needs to be an average of 1.5 kilowatts per parking space. Then there's flexibility in deciding, should that be met with all level 1 chargers? Should that be met with some level 2 chargers? Or should that be met with, say, one DCFC charger? So there's a lot of inherent flexibility then for who's developing to decide that structure, which is a pro. But on the flip side, you also want to make sure that we are future-proofing all of the EV charging that we're building. For example, if level 1 is going to become obsolete as more and more EVs want to use that charging infrastructure, and if the charging levels are just too low to even be useful for those EV drivers as more and more EVs get on the road, then we haven't future-proofed our charging ecosystem well enough. And that's up to each individual then business that's developing their charging infrastructure. So I'm going to pause here and throw it back to Brendan to see if he has additional thoughts on these options assessed and just some additional details there.
I won't say too much because Emma, I think you explained it quite well, and we're going to be hopefully having time for questions. I'll just step back a little bit and note that we were asked by the City of Richmond to help them think about, from a first principles basis, how best to structure their EV ready requirements for non-residential buildings. So Richmond had really led, they were the first in at least North America, maybe the world, to adopt 100% EV ready residential parking requirements, but they hadn't implemented anything for non-residential parking. And they'd seen that different jurisdictions across North America had established these sorts of requirements for non-residential parking in different ways and wanted a comparison of the implication of those. So, they were especially interested, okay, is there value in that sort of variable requirement by land use? It's definitely true that where we've got parking, where vehicles are parked for shorter periods of time, like more often, let's say retail settings, you want to have faster charging infrastructure that is serving those parking spaces. So that's what's led some jurisdictions, let's say District of Saanich, to adopt those sorts of requirements. A challenge is that municipal, where in Canada, a lot of these charging requirements have been located in the parking section of zoning bylaws. There's hundreds and hundreds of different uses contemplated in zoning. And actually, when new development's happening, a lot of times they don't necessarily understand what type of use a given development will ultimately have when they're doing the first large structure. So it can be a little bit too granular. And so that's one of the cautions about using that sort of variable rate, is sometimes, especially when you're contemplating a whole range of different uses, you might not know what those will be. Conversely, like in what's been done with the International Energy Conservation Code, it actually just outlines the different sorts of uses that are noted in building codes, which tend to be fewer. There's typically about 8 or so. So residential, business service, so as in like office environments, retail, and assembly would be like the big ones. And it might be more appropriate to use those sorts of defining different types of requirements for each of those different uses in a building code context. But in terms of what the tools that local governments have available to them, doing this in zoning, it can lead to a fair bit of granularity that's maybe artificially granular, I'd say. And also, when you've got that type of flat requirement, you might design for ultimately being able to have, let's say, 4 share on 40 amp circuits, and that might provide too slow charging in a, let's say, retail context like a grocery store. But you can just install only one charging station on those circuits and just have a charging station every 4 parking spaces in that parking lot. So the implication of it is that you'll just wind up having more distributed charging infrastructure versus it being concentrated in one part of the parkade, but it can still provide good quality charging services to folks. So I hope that is useful additional context and understandable here. Happy to answer further questions about that, and I'll pass it back to Emma.
Yeah, great. So I'm going to zoom through this so we can get to questions. 3 criteria that we use to assess those 3 different ways of structuring requirements is the cost, the user experience. When I say user experience, does the end user, the EV driver, have access to the appropriate type of charging? And ease of administration. Is it designer friendly to set up? Is the requirement easy to design, administer, and follow? So this was our overview of our findings. And as you can tell, spoiler alert, we're pointing out that option 1, or the flat rate, might be the best way to structure these requirements. So when it comes to cost per parking space, there's not one option that's best for how to structure requirements that will significantly be more cost effective. Cost is really dependent on the charging configuration and level if energy management systems are implemented. When it comes to the user experience, while option 2 best achieves that criteria, it can still be achieved by option 1. Option 3, there's more potential for designers to implement options that will result in a poor quality user experience if that's done poorly. And then when it comes to ease of administration, then option 1 is going to be the simplest and most straightforward to administer and interpret. Option 2 can be more challenging. And then option 3, it does provide designer flexibility, but that can also be challenging to interpret and administer, both a pro and a con. So then jumping to our recommendations fall similar to what we looked at North Van. So a minimum of 35% of parking spaces should include energized outlets capable of providing L2 charging or a higher charging level if desired. And that's to accommodate that workplace charging. And in terms of performance requirements, it can allow for up to 4 share on 40 amps or equivalent to allow for that load sharing aspect. And then also to include a minimum of 10% of parking spaces, 1 parking space, whichever is greater, shall include an energized outlet capable of supporting opportunity charging. So that's more where it's going to have a dedicated circuit so that you can have higher charging capacity to accommodate those shorter dwell times while the vehicles are there. Performance requirement would include a 40 amp dedicated circuit. That would be equivalent to a 6.6 kilowatt capacity per outlet. And then finally, to also allow for equivalent amounts of total power to be implemented through DCFC or higher power L2. One caveat though with DCFC is that if a business was going with that, they would also be required to install the actual charger itself and also to have a plan on who is operating and maintaining that infrastructure when it comes to DCFC. So consider opportunities to negotiate additional city or utility public charging networks when considering a DCFC instead of going with the A and B requirements. So our cheat sheet here at the bottom shows percent total parking stalls, minimum charging capacity, level 2 description, and then the minimum circuit voltage. And that is our first row there is detailing it for that workplace charging. And then that second row is detailing it for that opportunity charging. Okay, so our next slide is just questions. But what I'll do is I'll just leave this slide up so that people can still take that in if they want some more time to look at it or discuss it.
Okay. And I'm not sure if we'll have verbal questions or if we should just go through those that are noted in the question and answer section.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you guys so much for your flexibility and going through that presentation at a great pace. Super appreciate that. There's a couple questions here, and also Brendan, kudos to you for answering so many of them already while doing your presentation. I'm not sure how you managed all of that, but thank you.
Wow, so inarticulate.
Oh no, I was reading them too. I'm like, wow, this makes sense even to me, and I am not versed on this at all. So thank you so much. There's a few questions here. I see one has a thumbs up, so I guess that has been upvoted. It's a funny question. How do you manage the guy who plugs in and goes for a beer and forgets that he is tied up to a charger?
User fees. Ultimately, it's important for a variety of reasons to have people paying for the charging that they're using, and how you structure your user fees can encourage people to get off the infrastructure once they're fully charged or after a certain amount of time. So user fees vary all over the place, but some are structured where the first, let's say, hour worth of charging might be $2, and then it goes up to $5 an hour once you reach an 80% state of charge, and that just encourages people to go off. So he'll be less likely the next time. Hopefully he's not drunk driving home. Maybe he can just move his vehicle and get a taxi, but that's broadly how you do it.
Awesome. Marina has a question. You talk about avoiding personal vehicle use. Would there be any investment in public transportation like trains or buses, electric wise, to make it easier for people to not need their personal vehicle if traveling out of town?
It's a great idea. We should invest way more in that type of infrastructure, Marina. Completely agree.
Absolutely. And maybe one just comment on there. Most of my time is actually spent a lot on our EV adoption model here at Dunsky. And we focus a lot also on the MHDV category, specifically when it comes to buses in terms of school buses, transit buses, and coach buses and the different barriers that they face. But really what we're seeing more and more is just really trying to hit procurement targets when it comes to transit and school buses. And also then on top of that, electrifying those fleets, but also expanding public infrastructure where we can to really shift away from personal vehicle use.
Absolutely. I think we have 2 more questions, so we might be able to get everything in today. How do you manage the cost to charge? Regarding cost to charge, rates are different at different charges and sometimes are unclear. Is there any consideration at government level to harmonize all charging companies to regulate fees?
It's interesting, Lori. I don't think there is any serious consideration, although I'm not privy to all the conversations that are going on. The way markets tend to work is we try to strive towards having competitive conditions, but then we'll let the entities that are offering those services, provided they're not like natural monopolies or there's uncompetitive conditions happening, charge what prices they want. And if someone can provide it at a lower price, they'll enter the market and be able to get those sorts of rates. So I know that can be frustrating, especially in certain types of buildings. There can actually be kind of lock-in sort of characteristics that, let's say, multifamily buildings, you want to think carefully about, okay, do you want to use open protocols so that it's going to be easier to switch to a different charging service provider? Or if you operate a retail establishment or a workplace, same idea. Let's think carefully about, do we want to go with a service provider that offers excellent quality of service, but that does use proprietary, let's say, communications protocols or proprietary chargers, so that it's going to be more difficult to switch to a provider that isn't charging those services. So that is an important consideration, but broadly, I'm not aware of any types of discussions around trying to regulate this, because it's not like a, let's say, a wires company, like an electric distribution utility, where it's a natural monopoly. There is opportunity for competition, and so like the market can set the reasonable prices over time as more competition emerges. Hopefully that's useful.
Thank you. We'll go with one more question here from Trevor. Right now, EV chargers are often in premium spaces, I assume as a reward for environmentally minded drivers and probably because the wiring is easier. But if lots of people are going to be slowly charging their cars, we really want those to be further from the entry. Will it be costly to move chargers after the fact and or place chargers in the middle or back of a parking lot instead of beside the building?
Yeah, so typically where you wire, like where you get the electricity to, you're then going to be fixed there unless you're just going to rip out some of that electricity. Now, you wouldn't have to forego all the investments that you would make in your EV charging infrastructure. You have to have a certain amount of electrical capacity in the building to be able to provide power to a panel. And then there's a branch circuit from that panel to the parking space. So that branch circuit is fixed and the cost of getting that to that parking space is fixed. But you could, let's say, rip out that branch circuit, take power from the panel and move it elsewhere in the parking area. But I think generally, once there's power to a given parking space, it's going to keep offering EV charging there. And increasingly, as people drive EVs, there'll just be more and more people that are going to have access to that parking space. We do definitely want to, of course, make sure that we keep having accessible parking for all different types of vehicles located in appropriate places. But generally, we're just going to see a larger and larger proportion of parking spaces feature EV charging infrastructure. And the last thing I'll note is oftentimes it is like quite a bit lower cost to locate it closer to a building. If you could imagine a big surface parking lot, if you had one parking space that's right beside the Walmart and another that's half a mile away, it costs a lot more to dig a trench across all that parking lot and put it in the far corner of the parking lot rather than just putting it right beside the Walmart. So it's actually those kind of infrastructure considerations that dictate where these things are located to a not inconsiderable degree. Hope that helps.
It definitely does. Is there more power generation coming online to charge all those EVs?
Oh, yeah. Once we transition all the passenger vehicles to electric, I'm forgetting what the number is for Canada, but like in 20 years from now, let's say in British Columbia, it might add something like 15 or 20% more kilowatt hours that need to be delivered. So it's certainly not insignificant. It's also maybe not as much as you'd think. EVs are just so much more efficient than internal combustion vehicles. Like, you know, we use this huge amount of oil and petroleum to provide for gas-powered cars. Because those cars are operating at maybe 17% efficiency of wheels, whereas like EVs are operating at maybe 75 to 85% efficiency. So you need less power than you might expect, although it's not insignificant. I think this is a transition that is going to take place over, let's say, at least 20 years for all those vehicles to go electric. So there's going to be time to build the wind, the solar, the other forms of zero emissions power to be able to provide for it. And one thing that's handy about EVs is they are a very flexible load. So when the power is most expensive, let's say 6 p.m. on the coldest day of the year, you don't necessarily need to be charging your vehicle right at that time. You can reward drivers for delaying their charging and increasingly using EV energy management, not just to support how we manage like the impacts of infrastructure costs at a site scale, but also to optimize the load patterns of EVs at a grid scale is going to be an awesome opportunity to keep power prices low for everyone, integrate more variable renewable energy, and mitigate the impacts of this need to grow power consumption.
Thank you guys so much. Where there's demand, there definitely will be supply. We'll see that for sure in many various carbon efficient areas in the next 20 years. David has one last request, and maybe while we wrap up, Emma or Brendan, you can help him with this. It's in the chat. It's not in the question box, but in the webinar chat. I have been trying to contact authors of the Dunsky report for HRAI that quantified the benefit to the grid of GSHPs. Can you help?
Regarding ground source heat pumps, yeah, I'll take a look at that chat then before I log off.
Thank you so much, Emma, for that.
Actually, maybe this is the answer. Actually, David, if you want to shoot me a quick email, or if anyone has any further questions or comments that they'd love to follow up with me and Brendan on, I just want to throw this up on the screen feel free to contact us via email and we can get back to you that way.
Awesome. Thank you for the great discussion today. And most of all, thank you for your patience to everyone involved in our webinar today. This session has been recorded and it should be posted on our website by midweek to next week. You can find the session and all of our previous Discovery EE sessions under the Events tab. In the meantime, stay connected with us by joining our Discovery EE Hub or our mailing list for energy efficiency developments across the country. A quick reminder that there will not be a Discovery EE session next week. We will return in 2 weeks on June 9th, where our very own Abhi Kemtoneni will be presenting his latest research on tenant rights. Join us then. Thank you guys so much. Have a wonderful weekend. I hope we could have answered as many questions as we could today. Thank you so much for leaving your contact information, and we'll see each other soon.
Okay,
all right.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. And thanks, Natasha. Appreciate it.
Thank you guys so much.